Thank you, and thank you very much to our hosts for this panel and inviting these great panelists today. I just want to take a minute to set the stage and give you a little history of some of where we have been with regulatory frameworks, or probably more accurate to say, policy approaches, because there is not so much global regulation in the tech space. So in my mind, things kicked off in 2003 with the World Summit on the Information Society, otherwise known as WSIS. This was a multi-year process having more to do with internet governance, an enabling environment that would help what was called in the UN system ICTs grow and flourish, and developing countries be able to participate. The WSIS documents actually underlie most of the discussion in international fora, particularly the UN. I can tell you that it underlies the G20 digital economy document last year. You cannot have a discussion in multilateral fora without somebody bringing up something from WSIS. The documents date to 2003. There was a 2003 and a 2005 document. And right, wrong, or indifferent, we live with those documents today. The second, what I would call underlying process to where we are today, started in 2004 with the UN group of governmental experts looking at what was called at the time information security. We refer to it today as cybersecurity. That is a non-binding voluntary process that also continues to be discussed today. And we'll hear a little bit more about it in a couple minutes. The discussion really hit a fevered pitch and hit the news in 2012 with a conference called what we call WICET, the World Congress on International Telecommunications. That was in 2012 in Dubai. That's a process, a treaty process run by the International Telecommunications Union. I would predict that we will see again, this is a treaty conference year at the ITU, which will again be meeting in October in Dubai, and we will see calls and perhaps even a vote for an international cybersecurity treaty. You will see some calls for an international regulation of internet, and for the first time, you will see a lot of discussion about various aspects of the digital economy. So with the speed of change that technology drives in terms of new services, new business models, new use cases, and new patterns of disruptions of old industries, is a top-down, centralized, global regulatory approach, or for that matter, static domestic legislation, even effective in addressing what should be addressed market failures? Let alone, do those mechanisms support innovation? Do they support the growth of new industries? And do they support investment? Kevin Lynch, who is a former Canadian government official, and now I think vice chair of the Bank of Montreal, looks at the issues of policy approaches that governments can take and the speed of technological change. And he has called those two differences between tech and policy a policy gap between the scale, scope, and speed of technological transformations and the capacity of government to implement timely and effective policy changes. He sums up the dilemma as, quote, "In today's dynamic world, last generation governance and policy processes are a poor match for next generation disruptive trends." So perhaps there are different approaches that one can take, governments can take, be it domestic or international government fora, on the scale of intervention. from my worst case scenario of a 150-year-old institution serving as a global regulator to a laissez-faire approach where anything goes. Our panelists today have some innovative ideas and insights as to how policymakers can approach today's quickly evolving environment and fully realize the opportunities and benefits technology can bring. So our panelists come from the perspectives of former government officials to entrepreneurs and innovators. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna divide our panel in two. We're gonna take a look at policy approaches, then we're gonna turn to our innovators who will look at the flip side of a policy approach, and that is what kind of ingredients do startup companies, innovators, investors need in terms of an enabling environment. So Deborah has a presentation for us that will set the stage for the technology discussion and overview where we're at with some of the burgeoning technologies.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here and a real honor to be in a room with so much expertise. Although I've been, Susan, thank you for the, whoops. My innovation today is this thing called paper. So bear with me for a little bit. Thank you for the introduction, although I've been put in the first category of those who are sketching out the base. I hope to be disruptive, and I hope to maybe changing a few minds is a little bit beyond my pay scale on this panel, but at least to introduce some new thinking. So I want to talk about three things in the really brief time that's been allotted to me. Can everybody hear me okay? Even in the back, so microphones work. So I want to talk about innovative technologies really quickly. I want to talk about big data as a regulatory challenge. And I want to talk about innovative regulation and how we really need to move, bottom line, from the comfort zone of top-down regulation to something that looks completely different that I call innovative regulation. So topic number one is innovative technologies. Okay, everybody in this room is an expert in various aspects of innovative technologies. I have three words to say to start off our discussion of innovative technologies. The three words are 5G, 5G, and 5G. As everybody in the room knows, 5G is is the current upgrade to our wireless technologies. Various actors, state and non-state, were involved in its evolution. It took a really long time. It seems as if we're now in the actual let's get this done stage. We'll see. So if we're going to get faster communication, more volume of communication, lower prices to our communication, we're really moving, I have this expressed pictorially, if we've been running a race so far, we're really going to be taking off in a rocket according to the promises that the folks supplying us with 5G are making to us. Why is this important in terms of regulation? I'm in my real identity a telecom lawyer, so I look carefully at the infrastructure regulation. How do you set this up? Where do you put the metal? Where do you put the towers? Where do you put the pipes? That's regulatory challenge number one for technological challenge number one. A second challenge that we have with the 5G piece is with the advent or with the coming into play over the next 10 or 15 years with absolutely unprecedented quantities of data, something we're going to come back to in a second. How in the world are we going to, is it effective to start thinking about content governance, content regulation, which is already a hopeless case, as we know, when the data becomes such big data, unprecedentedly so, how do we even start to think about content regulation? So that's innovation number one. Innovation number two, again, everybody in this room is already bored out of his or her mind with talking about cloud computing. But with cloud computing, again, if we look at it, if we try to look at the regulatory challenges, not necessarily a technological innovation. So as we're seeing in the current, these days, the US versus Microsoft case, for example, cloud computing says to international lawyers and national lawyers, what do we do with this jurisdictional problem? Where is that data? And it's not a trivial question for legal systems which are very much based in territory under state state sovereignty and state jurisdiction. So that's regulatory issue number two. Number 2.5, IoT. So we all know that the numbers look like 30 million IoT connected objects by 2020. You know, throw out however many billion objects do you want. I would pinpoint the regulatory challenge here. There are hundreds of them. But one of them is, what do you do about data breaches or cyber breaches on billions of objects? Again, it's a question of how we even think as regulators, as badly as we're doing now in encountering this problem. How do we even think differently about regulating so many final points of data, of interaction with data? My final example in terms of the innovation, Susan and I have discussed this example, is one that I hope is going to surprise a few people in the room. I'm really intrigued by it. So it came out of a TED talk in 2013. Vint Cerf, one of the founders of the internet, was one of the presenters. How many people in the room have heard about interspecies internet? Just raise your hand. Nobody, wow, okay. So this is a real thing. I'll take a few seconds to explain it, and I hope you'll all go and check it out. It's a fascinating idea, I think, with untold ramifications, and it segues from the work that we're all familiar with of scientists like Jane Goodall and many, many others who do work on animal languages, the mammals, so whale languages and dolphin languages and gorilla languages, and are working sort of very slowly and carefully on digitizing animal languages. Now, I can see some brains whirring in the room already. Once we have animal languages digitized, there's no reason we can't do a Google Translate up and have some interesting direct communication. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not a technologist, so I've sort of made that leap, but I'm seeing the smiles on the faces in the room. What an amazing technological innovation that brings regulatory problems to the fore that we can't even imagine. And this is real, this is not. Take a look at the TED Talk. So that's my final sort of technological innovation that brings regulatory challenges that I want to talk about. Topic 2 is big data as a regulatory issue. So absolutely unprecedented quantities of data. How do we start to think about these quantities of data as innovative regulators? And I want to throw us back to a sort of leave the quantitative issue and go to a qualitative issue that is a question that keeps coming up in the legal, the policy, the general governance discussions that I've been involved in lately. And it's really that we're very confused about data as a concept. Maybe some of you have figured this out, but I know that I'm not sure whether data is property, is a negotiable good. Sometimes it's a service. Is it a product? Is it a commodity? Is it part of my personal identity, my own personal data? Or is it something separate from me? Is it a relationship with a machine? Is it a tool or a weapon? It may be all of these under certain circumstances, but again, coming back to Susan's focus about how do we look at the regulation of data, I think we're wondering collectively, you'd be happy to know if anybody in the room has the answer. I think we're really wondering collectively about how we sort of catch the tail of the elephant, the ear of the elephant, and make sense of data, even before we get to the questions of quantity, looking at the quality issues. Final point, innovative regulation. So I come from the world of cyberspace regulation and cyberspace norms, and I know that Marina is going to talk a lot more in depth about them as the expert in the room. So clearly, coming from a regulatory point of view, we need thresholds. We need regulatory thresholds. We need to know how to govern all of the issues that I've touched on and many, many more. Only here's the problem. So states and organizations have checked out of this particular hotel. They've shied away, I know we'll hear more about this, they've shied away from setting norms because of geopolitical realities, because of other realities. So how do we move ahead anyway without getting this normative piece done? We need to get past the perception that we can't do this, that there's a normative crisis, and we throw up our hands and say, we just don't know how to regulate content globally. We've got to move past that moment. Why do we need to move past? Because in a regulatory vacuum, it doesn't last for long. Many different influences that are much less governable than a regulatory approach enter. Some may be good, others may not be so good. So technology, and I'm summing up, technology requires, I think, a two-pronged approach. And this is what I would offer, I hope, a little bit disruptively for the panel, and we can go into detail a little bit later. I think we need a two-pronged approach, and I would sum it up this way. First of all, I think we should recommit to the normative project globally for thinking in a focused way, with as much consensus as we can muster about rule of law agreed norms on a global level. It's a long-term project, it's going to take a lot of time, but I don't think we should abandon it, number one. Number two is kind of a cop-out from what I just said. Until we get to this is prong number two, until we get to such point as we can actually talk about agreed norms, and we can go into detail about what these look like later, then I think we need to push the lawyers out of the way, push the regulators out of the way, let private sector actors move in and make some progress, and also think how we enable confidence-building measures, certs and C-certs, the technical people to get in and solve problems without legal norms and without making a lot of noise, to do it sort of under the radar. And I'm happy to supply a few examples. I'll end with one example of government innovation in my own country, in Israel, that seems to be working pretty well. And that is our regulatory, the Israel Innovation Authority, which used to be a government body in our Ministry of the Economy, and which has been able to divorce itself or separate itself from the government and at least have a foot and a half outside of the government so that it has more independence. And its entire mandate is to fund R&D, carefully and light-handedly regulate innovation in Israel, and push forward as quickly as possible innovation on a number of fronts. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Deborah. I can see the pencils flying. Everybody wants to know about regulating elephant speak now. So following your comments about states and organizations perhaps having given up on cyber regulation or at least developing cyber norms, Marina is an expert in a couple processes, and it can talk about the UN GGE experience, as well as a new endeavor that she's part of that just recently launched, the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. So Marina, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Well, to start with, I'm really happy and privileged to be part of this panel, and especially because it's such a gender-balanced panel after men discuss the G20. But cyber came into my professional life in 2007. I'm a former career diplomat, and 2007, when my country fell under the first ever cyber attacks by one state against another state for political reasons, I was Estonian ambassador to Russia, which means my duty was to try to find the ways of cooperation, and my duty was to learn in 5 minutes what are DDoS attacks and start explaining to foreigners. When I was posted to Washington, D.C. as an ambassador, it was Snowden revelation, the lowest in trust in transatlantic relations between the United States and Europe. Nobody wants to hear from friends and partners that they're being spied on. So I understood I can't escape cyber. After that, I was happy to participate twice as Estonian expert in the United Nations group of governmental experts, which gave me a pretty good understanding what are the capabilities of the United Nations and what is the global thinking about cybersecurity. And today I'm proud to chair the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. I'm very happy that my co-chair, Lata Reddy, is here, and another great Indian is in our commission, Samir Saran, who is not with us today, but who is also part of the commission. So that gave me the view from the apolitical side as a multi-stakeholder. So what are the lessons learned so far? I'd like to stop on the following points: cooperation, clarity, multi-stakeholder approach. Cyber does not have borders. Cybersecurity does not have borders. And that's why international cooperation is crucial. When I say international cooperation, I mean both global, also regional. Globally, at the moment, we are standing at the verge of deep ideological division. The United Nations group of governmental experts that was mandated to look into 5 different fields of cybersecurity: emerging threats, capacity building, confidence building, applicability of international law, and responsible behavior of states, failed in international law and failed to produce a consensus report in the summer of 2017. Why? Because on one hand, we have countries, and I'm proud to represent one of those countries, Estonia, where we see the benefits of the use of ICTs for society, for economy, for culture, for the whole nation. India belongs to those countries. On the other side, we have countries who see the use of ICTs as an interference into their domestic affairs, into brainwashing their citizens with Western values, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, this division is becoming bigger and bigger. That's why we were not able to agree on applicability of international law. At the same time, I want to stress that cyberspace is not a lawless jungle. United Nations agreed in 2013, international law, UN Charter in its entirety applies to cyber, full stop. We all agreed to that, all UN member states. The question today is not whether, but the question is how. And that's a difficult question, because I would argue to have stable cyberspace, we need clarity and we need predictability. From the business's perspective, but also from the perspective of international peace and security. If we look into the recent cyber incidents, being it cutting off power grid in Ukraine, or hacking democracy, interference into electoral systems and elections in other countries, all these cases are playing in the gray zone, where international law so far has not been very explicit. And that is something that governments have to take very seriously and have to look into applicability of international law. Academia, private sector can't do that. Academia can propose solutions, and academia has done that. I'd like to refer to the Tallinn manual, 600-page of interpretation of international law. But that's academia. Now it's up to governments, legal advisors, to look into what can be done. And in this situation, when states, I would say, have taken time off, states are getting together to discuss how to continue discussions, I see a big role for multi-stakeholders. When I say multi-stakeholders, I mean all. Industry, private sector, academia, civil society, and IT folks. The geeks with ponytails, who some 5 years ago thought that they are exceptional. They don't have to talk to humans like us in the language that we understand. We were problem makers. We were pushing wrong buttons. We were opening wrong attachments. We were problem makers. I would argue that it has changed. IT folks want to discuss with us and with all the other multi-stakeholders, and they want to speak the language, and they are already speaking the language that we understand. Governments can't shade away. In cybersecurity, governments are having and will have central role. Governments have to bear responsibility for what's happening internationally and nationally. Governments are the ones who have to be responsible for authentication of persons online. Governments have to be responsible for secure exchange of data, integrity of data, and no compromises. But they can't do it alone. They have to cooperate with others. And here comes industry, private sector. Private sector today owns critical infra. Private sector is the one that provides online services. And I would like to recognize the work done by for example, Microsoft or Siemens, who are proposing norms. I don't think that Microsoft's idea of Geneva Convention is a good idea. I don't think that. I think that instead of writing new conventions, we should look into what we have. But I would like to recognize for what they're doing. And the same about the Global Commission. We are an apolitical institution. And when we got together, our first idea was, how can we contribute to the predictability, clarity of cyberspace? And we thought that the basis is the security of internet. Free, open, available, resilient, accessible internet. So the first norm we proposed is the protection of the public core of the internet, the very basic, naming, routes, protocols, and so on. And it should be accessible, and it should be acceptable to all states. Because all states who want to develop and be developed see internet and cyberspace as the backbone of their economies. All states should be interested in not interfering into or cutting internet. And we think that as an apolitical organization, we have today more leverage. And my final remark, I listened very carefully to the discussion about G20. G20 is doing a great job, but I think that it's also time for G20 to recognize the importance of multi-stakeholders. Otherwise, we're repeating it. It's like an energy circle. We come together and we repeat multi-stakeholder approach, multi-stakeholder approach. It's time to move from a policy statement to real cooperation. And I think that G20 and Argentinian chairmanship can play a great role here. Thank you, and I'll stop here.
Thank you for that. So we've heard a couple different suggestions as well as some real-life work that is being done right now on the policy front. So now we're going to turn it over to our innovators and talk about how they're innovating with all this drama going on in the background. And, but more importantly, what is it that would serve as an effective enabling environment? So over to you.
Thank you, Gateway House, Manjeet, for inviting me. Let me explain what is happening on the world across industries. Oil, 97 million barrels of oil consumed per day, 60% to transportation, 50% of that will be gone by 2030 because of electric vehicles. $6 trillion industry has come down to $4 trillion industry, and we're going to see a very deep impact happening in the next 12, 13 years. Utilities. 17% of Europe's energy is alternate energy. By 2030, 30% of world energy will be alternate energy. People will come off the grid. They'll have their own microgrid with solar, put into storage, put a car, go 300 miles. And it's going to be with no cost. So this regulated grid, regulated industry is gone. So we're going to have a cell on the utility industry all around the world, and that's going to accelerate. When fuel cells come into play, we're going to see a lot of fun happening in that industry too. So oil and energy. If you go to manufacturing, 3D printing is 3% of the world's manufacturing today. By 2030, it'll be 30%. It means I can sit down here on my PC, get a design of a car, press a button, next door the car will be printed out in 24 hours. So racing engines have been printed, rocket engines have been printed, parts of the human skull have been printed, the thigh bone has been printed, houses have been printed. So 3D printing will be 30% of world manufacturing by 2030, and is accelerating. So what happens to the regulations about the automobile, about their emission, and all the nice things we hear? Because they're all centralized and central controlled. So we are seeing the industrial revolution model getting totally disrupted. Then you go on to biotechnology, robotic surgery, stem cell research to make body parts and regenerate, maybe create body parts outside. And then you have DNA bespoke medicine, where medicine will be given to you based upon your DNA, and compounds will be synthesized based upon big data, because 30% of chemicals don't agree with human beings. When that happens, this whole FDA regulations about medicine is gone. And what do you do about regulations for that purpose? And then you come on to the process of aging. By looking at your DNA and stopping the process of aging, which happens at age 30, you're able to prolong your aging and live much longer. So what happens to equity, and what happens to people who cannot afford to do all that kind of thing and who are going to be the main voters? Brain research. The brain has 80 billion neurons, many, many more synapses. The brain works through weak electrical impulses. Now, brain research is proving that in the lab, you can send weak electrical impulses to the brain of a rat and make the muscles twitch. So 10 years later, if you're able to send weak electrical impulses into your brain and make your brain behave in a very different way, then I don't know what regulators are going to do in the United Nations, because we don't know. And also, look at the human life. Can you grow a human being in a Petra dish? Lambs have been grown in a womb outside the body. In artificial womb, lambs have been grown. All right? The day is not far when you have a designer baby. It is actually happening, because in the valley today, you can do DNA analysis between two people who want to make a baby and see whether the baby will have what kind of DNA, whether it's going to be getting a inherited disease, and remake the baby and then go do something else to make the baby what you want. Now, all these advances are changing the way that things have been regulated in the world today. And look at supply chains. The supply chain is the creation of the Industrial Revolution. Factories, Industry 1.0, the components come in, you assemble Industry 2.0, you automate. Now with Industry 4.0, totally automated with robots working all over, and the global supply chain, which was built up from the supplier to the buyer with all kind of people in between, is getting totally disrupted by 3D printing and localized manufacture and robotics manufacturing. And that is going to change the way you navigate the seas and navigate roads and all that. Autonomous cars. Cars driving by themselves. What happens to the insurance industry? What happens to liability if cars drive by themselves? What happens to car ownership? And what happens to many things that are associated with automation happening in a very significant way? And then you come to financial services. The central bank regulating the payment system is gone. The payment system is now getting disaggregated. On the balance sheet, liability side, asset side, both sides are getting disaggregated by people who do remittances through the system, people who are able to do credit analytics and give loans to everybody, people are able to disaggregate your deposit in the banking system, and banks are shrinking, banks are coming down. And we don't know what shape is going to take in the future. Education. We are in Education 2.0, which is an industrial revolution model where we have one teacher teaching to everybody. Tomorrow you're going to have a virtual degree where you go to a MOOCs course, takes any course that you want, and get a designer degree. I get a degree with nuclear science, with music, with dance, and with accounting, and with physics and biology, collect all the credits, go to a virtual university and get a degree. Is it happening? Yes, with MOOCs, with 30-40% there. And then, if you look at technology, huge cloud computing capacity, unbelievable capacity, right? And cloud computing being all over, like they said, negotiating the data. What happens to the data? And with quantum computing coming into being, which can be 20 times faster and more powerful than the best computing system we have, and the chips have been designed, and China is investing heavily in that, all the cryptography that made for security is all going to be hacked. And cryptography is going to be broken. So what kind of regulations you're going to have? Then data. Google and Facebook have more data about you than anybody else. They're beyond any government. Facebook has 2.6 billion people. Google has all the information. When you go to Google and search, artificial intelligence mechanisms, algorithms are going to find out what you're doing, create your own pattern, and give you the information what you want, like possibly the Russians did in the election. So they're going to put things into your mind before the election to change your mind and control your mind. And we're all trusting people who trust regulators to help us survive and keep our individual freedom and individual liberty. So individual freedom, individual liberty is a threat by these mega global digital monopolies. And we don't have regulation, except EU did a fabulous job in telling Google what to do, because Google was destroying all innovative companies. If you take the totality of this and see how the world is going to get disrupted in every single industry, every single facet of a life, we are in for a surprise as to regulations and policy, warfare. Warfare is fought with drones. 7,000 kilometers away, satellite images, drones, picking up telecommunication signals and sending all those things to bash you up. Yes, you're all safe in America. It's happening in Waziristan. Tomorrow you could come home to drones which are beyond the radar, right? And you can have robots fighting those wars. Because today, in most parts of the world, manufacturing is becoming robotic. When the robots come and robots have artificial intelligence able to do many things because of pattern recognition and big data, you're in for trouble. Now in the lab, an AI algorithm has created a baby AI. So can people do emotional thinking or lateral thinking because of an algorithm? Not right now. But if you have a huge computing facility and you keep everything into an algorithm, you'll be in for a surprise. Like she said, about interspecies internet and everything else is a big data problem. You take all the sound synthesizes, try to find equivalence, and you can get something done. And then put into a machine, and the machine will do everything for you. So, if you look at this, the impact on jobs, where are the jobs? Because the jobs, like somebody said in the morning, is going to be in high technology, and all the nice things we do, and buying the yacht, and the double house, and the big holiday in the US, is all under threat. 15 million jobs in America disappeared because of automation of the last 15 years. Middle class income has not gone up, and there's going to be challenges. So what are you going to regulate? First, we need to understand what are you going to regulate, how are you going to regulate, and when are you going to regulate? What are you going to regulate? Regulators here are 2 generations behind innovation. We should have some younger people who are doing that to come and tell us what they're doing to find out how to regulate them, make them behave. Now, the people who are coming to you like Microsoft, like maybe a Google or somebody, are not the innovators because they're establishment figures. They want to capture the regulators to protect them from being broken up by innovators. I'm making a very profound statement. All these people are talking to you like Microsoft, want to capture you because they got a fantastic advantage, they're making lots of money, and they want regulation to protect them from getting disrupted by somebody else because they're 2 generations behind the curve of innovation that's happening around the world. So what are you going to regulate? How are you going to regulate? When are you going to regulate? We don't have answers. The only thing I can say is, look to the future, see all the things that are happening in the labs, find out what is going to be the likely impact, and start writing small pieces of regulations or policy so that you're prepared, and get in younger people who understand how the young people interact with each other. Now, Facebook is getting disrupted by kids because they don't want to be on Facebook. But Facebook has all the data. And Facebook does no evil except that they have an algorithm which is out to make more money out of you. And when the world has 7.5 billion smartphones with all the kind of data going all over the place, then what you said is going to be beyond redemption, beyond any regulation, beyond any policy. So policy has to catch up, look to the future, create those papers, get young people, because consumer behavior has changed. Now, what you behave and I behave to regulations is very different from what young people behave. For them, everything is free. It's a sharing economy. Everything is on an app. There is no ownership of assets, and everything is available to everybody, right? And lastly, disruptive capital. Now, the world has $8 trillion of interest-free money because the bonds, 0 interest rates. The money is being used to pump into innovation, and innovation cycles have come down from 36 months to 18 months, maybe shorter, and the sheer flow of money going to innovation will accelerate along with cloud, along with quantum computing and the new things that are coming, AI algorithms, which are very, very extensive. Now, that is the problem I want to face to all of you, to discuss what we should do, what should we do, when should we do it? How should we do it? Because the moment you do something is already stale and already disrupted. No, I'm very confused because I see this, I read about it, I don't know what to do. Except in India, we want a data privacy law, data residency law, in the hope data can be reside here. But data could be anywhere.
I'd also like to take a moment to appreciate, as a conference producer myself, the wonderful thing about being a minority as a man on a panel like this. It's pretty fantastic. Something that we are always striving for and only sometimes we get. So congrats, and I'm proud to be here. So I run Get Global. I founded the company about 3 years ago, and it's an event and media platform focused on international expansion, How do you go into foreign markets? How do you pick the right ones? How do you understand the cultures of those foreign markets? And we came about this by recognizing that if you're an expanding company in the United States trying to go into foreign markets, you don't really have a whole lot of opportunities or methods for finding out how to do this the right way. You have the Department of Commerce, or you have some consulting firms, but no one's going to give you a comprehensive view. So getting into this, we get to deal with a lot of startups. We get to deal, most of them Series B, a lot of legacy tech companies. We're based in California, so we get a lot of the frontier technology entities there. And at the same time, we have a lot of policy in our events. And the nice thing about being an event producer like this is that it's a little bit like being a magazine editor or a journalist, and you do have to really understand these problems to be able to feed them back to the public and your audience in the way that helps them understand these problems better. And in getting out and talking to these companies, there are a few things that I've seen. Number one, they don't think about regulatory frameworks. They're making things, right? They don't care if they exist. They don't know that they exist. If you look at Uber, they were slamming into things all over the world, had some serious trouble in certain markets, and yet they persisted and kept on moving. And you find this with a lot of companies, and nobody really takes any of this stuff seriously until they're forced to reckon with them. I spent some time in DC, still have a lot of friends there on the Hill and in the trade associations. None of these folks hire lobbyists until it is impassable for them to grow as a company and to live as a company until they start communicating with lawmaking bodies. So, when you're dealing with these companies that are making things that change the world, they don't really think, the first thing is that they don't want to be regulated. They don't want to have their innovations slowed down, but there are things that they do understand. They do understand first principles. So if you're an e-commerce company, or if you're a virtual reality company, or if you're in AI, you don't want to be governed or slapped on the wrist by someone who doesn't understand you, but they do understand privacy. They do understand safety. They understand dual-use technologies. They do understand things like the ethics around autonomous driving. So, if you're in an autonomous driving vehicle and you're in a situation in which there's something that is not sensing you, a wagon full of children or something like that, does your algorithm in your car prompt you to, and you're in a situation where it's their life or yours, do you buy the car where it's their life, or do you buy the car where it's your life? And if you buy the car that it's their life, do you have to put something on the car to denote that you've made that choice? So they do think about things like these. So another thing that they also recognize, and I think that the trade associations and a lot of the bodies that are involved in negotiating and influencing these frameworks, is that they realize that these things move so quickly that when you develop rules about them, that they expire quickly. And it takes a lot to keep up, and negotiating them takes time. I mean, this is one of the reasons why NAFTA 2.0 is, at first we were shocked that we would have to go that route, but, there was some merit in the idea of adding, digital economy chapters and things like that. So, I think I'm gonna, there's one more point. There is another thing that they welcome, which is talking to people. So, there's this idea or this image of these innovators going and doing things in a Wild West format and just doing whatever they want to do and not talking to anybody. In some ways it's true, and in some ways it's not. In the ways that it's not is that there are times of the year where they do get together with the regulators, they do get together with staffers on the Hill, and they speak on the same panels, and they go to the same cocktail parties. When you go to CES, and I go there every time as a guest of the Consumer Technology Association, which produces CES. The government affairs crowd is massive, and they organize fantastic tours, and they get to talk to the entrepreneurs who are there. Same thing with South by Southwest. So they do talk a lot, and there is fruit that comes out of this. So for instance, drones. Drone manufacturers were absolutely terrified that they would be subject to onerous rules under the FAA. Until the FAA started showing up at their doorstep and speaking on panels with them, and the senior-most people at the FAA decided that they wanted to sit around and get to know these people. And that led to a pretty reasonable set of rules that I think everybody recognized was helpful to the industry and to a sensible way forward. Similar thing with autonomous driving. I think everybody's kind of amazed at how fast this space has developed. In California, you can get in a Tesla now and experience what that's like. Not in the fully developed way, but a version of it. And that came from people going and spending time with regulators or lawmakers in California and in Washington, D.C., and a genuine curiosity by those folks to see this be successful because they geek out on it too. They want to see the future in their lifetime. They love it. And so they want to support that, and they recognize that this makes American exports so much stronger. So anyway, I guess my contribution to this panel is to say that, talking, we talk a lot about, interacting with stakeholders and things like that. I interviewed a lot of people to come here, and the one thing that I heard from all of them, whether they were from the European Commission or in San Francisco or in Sacramento or in Los Angeles, is get out and talk to folks. And that's where I'll leave off.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for those thought-provoking comments. I don't really even know where to start with all of that. But I saw a lot of note-taking, so what I'm going to do is ask you kind of a generic question so you can have the opportunity to respond to your colleagues here. So let me just frame it up like this. When is regulation needed? Are we talking prescriptive ex-ante regulations, even though innovation is happening on an 18-month cycle, and are our governments really capable of that? When do our current offline laws work? We just had, as pointed out, Google had a finding by the EU's competition authority. A month ago, the India competition authority had a finding. So are those offline laws not working? What's broken? So let me frame it that way in terms of what kind of regulation, if regulation, or do you wait for the market failure to occur and then look at how to correct? Do you wait for the consumer harm to occur, but in the meantime let 1,000 flowers bloom and let innovators innovate and survive and fail as the market kind of warrants? So I'll just go down the line. Deborah.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up in answering your question and trying to answer your tough question. I love the flowers blooming piece, but I'm actually going to pick up on the point about talking. And I think we heard what I was hearing from co-panelists, and I hope this is going to come back to you, is that we know that there's a gap that is sometimes unbridgeable between the technological innovations and developments and what market actors and the general public are understanding about these developments. And you talked about having the conversations, you talked about the technological gaps, and there's a normative piece in there as well. So I don't have the answer about when we regulate, but I do want to, if I may, take a moment to put in a little bit of track records of countries who've thought about how to do this in particular ways. And this is mostly some insights from research. So if anyone in the audience wants to say you have that all wrong, please do. I'll start with Estonia. So Estonia's done a lot of, I think, really creative thinking about how to regulate what happens in cyberspace as a result of events of 2007. And one of the things that I'm really intrigued by Estonian government regulation of how you regulate cyberspace is the redundancy piece. So if I have this right, Marina, and you'll correct me, Estonia has thought in terms at the highest level of how the government regulates itself, which is a really important piece that we can't forget. It is working on a project to make Estonia a cloud-based government. So it's government as a service, and there's an off-site, offline, virtual Estonian government that is completely redundant. So in fact, if everything works well, any cyber attacks on governmental sites are useless. So that would be the government regulating itself. And I've probably oversimplified 1,000 times, but that kind of thinking about how do we do government differently? How do we self-regulate differently? So that would be number one. The government looking at its own regulation of governmental bodies and doing that the best way it can. And in Israel, that's absolutely it's in our cyber policy, for example. Government first. First, we regulate ourselves. That's the kind of leadership we want to show to our public. Another good example that I'm really intrigued with is the French example. So from what I know, when France did the legislation of its one of its cyber laws, and this is classic regulation, top-down, but it did it a little bit differently. It had town meetings all around France, I think between 20 and 30, to meet with the public, outreach, and sit down in town halls or city halls and say, okay, here's what we're thinking about doing. Let's try and close that gap. Back to your talking piece. Let's try and close that gap and hear what your questions are and how we can make this regulation go down a little bit more easily. And that is that concept of abandoning the top-down model. You know, look it up in the law books and you'll know what to do. That's just not going to work anymore. So here's France thinking about that in a little bit of a different way. And I'll just take another example of the Netherlands. In my mind, the Netherlands can do no wrong in terms of its regulatory outputs, and they do something that I really wish Israel would do a lot better, and that is something that's called regulation by information. So the government of the Netherlands on a regular basis, other governments may do this as well, we don't in Israel yet, publishes an annual report on how it is doing in closing that gap between what the public understands, including business public understands as the regulation in cyberspace within that country, and how the government has closed those gaps, and it's a how we're doing report, and it grades itself. So again, I guess to sum up in answering your question, and I've gone on a little bit, I think government leadership in thinking in innovative ways about how to do this is step number one.
I would say that we need to break it up into two phases. One is catch-up, and other one is futuristic. In the catch-up phase, what are the big challenges? Data residency, data privacy, the right of the individual to his own data in terms of consent, and then the digital monopolies, to be a few. These are big problems which are very evident today. We need a global convention as early as possible to tackle this. Drafts out there which are simple to understand before the situation gets even worse, especially about the individual and data. Because if that is not urgently done through an international convention, we're going to get deeper into problems because it's going to become a deep political issue as it has become between Russia and the United States. And that's going to be even more dangerous. So I think that's important. Second is, we have to find out where is innovation happening, what are the new things that are happening. And wherever things are happening, put out thought papers with draft kind of guidelines, I would say, so that people are doing the innovation, we look at them and come back and give you feedback so you get information very fast. Don't wait for the innovation to become so big that suddenly you are out of your depth. So we need to have a pool of people who are going to track everything in each industry and find out the innovation and just produce some thought papers, some draft, what are the likely impact, what has to be done, understanding that the great mass of humans are going to be the receiving end of a small group of innovators. Small group could be a few million, 10 million, 20 million, but compared to 7.6 billion, they're very small. So what is going to be the likely impact? For example, I just saw this, read this article about a lamb growing in a womb outside, outside the mother lamb or mother sheep or whatever it is. Now, it's actually working. It's working. And meat growing in a dish. So you don't have to have cattle and slaughter them. You grow the same kind of a meat with the same texture and it's come to almost the same thing growing in a dish. Now these are food items, may sound funny to you, and brain research. Should we allow researchers to send weak electrical impulses to control the brain circuitry in the mind? They're doing it, but if that's what happens, how will society react? So you put out position papers, because what we need is the innovators, like he said, to start thinking of the likely impact and come back and say what they think they should be under. Now, should we do away with regulations? We have done that for the last 15 years, and we are in a mess. We've done it for the last 15 years after Microsoft, except for the EU. We must thank the EU, because I don't think people in this world understand the impact of what Google has done. Because Google is stifling innovation, and Google is talking to you about regulations because they want to control their monopoly. So handling this monopoly is important, and putting out the thought papers. If we're able to do that, it'll be a quantum leap in a quantum computing era to look at policy and maybe regulations.
I come from Europe, yeah? EU is known for over-regulating. We love to regulate. So I think that maybe the two basic rules for regulations are, at least from my perspective, less regulation is better than more regulation, and no regulation is better than bad regulation. But we need some regulation. And Mohandas referred to, for example, the EU's GDPR regulation on the privacy of the data of the EU citizens. I think it's important. And when I was listening that innovators or companies don't care about regulations or are not very much interested in those, they have to be. Otherwise, they will be soon paying for not fulfilling the requirements introduced, for example, by that regulation. And also when I was listening to Mohandas, it was such a desperate talk. I'd like to bring some positive notes to our discussion. No, you were not. Even when you were talking about young kids.
I'm following Claude's honesty, to be very frank.
I'll bring an example. Back in Estonia, we introduced cyber hygiene and programming to our first graders, 7-year-old kids. We tried to reach out to those in the kindergarten, but you can't, because not all of them are coming to the kindergarten. So for the first time, government gets children is when they are in the first grade. I was last August in Las Vegas at Black Hat and DEF CON conferences. These are the conferences where we have, 30,000 hackers coming together. And they were discussing how to cooperate with schools. DEF CON hackers cooperate with police and go to school and teach kids cyber hygiene. I would argue that the same way you can teach your people to think. Again, I'm coming from Europe. Europe today is fighting with information wars and propaganda. I come from a country where we have had information wars and propaganda since '91, non-stop, since we regained independence. And I would argue that our people are more resilient. You have to educate people, and then the results will be better. And a couple of more positive examples. I was listening to the discussion of autonomous vehicles. A year ago, back at home in Estonia, the same ministry that was under Minister Palo, who spoke yesterday, started developing a draft law on autonomous vehicles. And then they discovered it's too narrow. And they switched to artificial intelligence. Why? Because in our neighboring country, in Finland, there is a company called Tieto, where artificial intelligence is already on the board of directors, with the same rights as all other directors. She has the right to vote. She's deciding. She's a lady. Her name is Alicia. Although in Finland, as well as in Estonia, there is no regulation yet. What is the legal status of artificial intelligence? But because of that Finnish company, our government started immediately drafting the laws, and I think that the laws will be adopted in the first half of this year, regulating the liabilities, responsibilities, and so on of artificial intelligence. Governments have to be innovative and fast. And the last example, maybe I'll bring from my country. And Deborah, thank you so much for promoting Estonia. By the way, I didn't pay her. She's doing it out of her free will. But a year ago, we concluded an agreement with Luxembourg, a friendly country, to have a data embassy in the territory of Luxembourg. Data embassy, like an embassy, like a classical embassy where we have immunities, privileges, access to the servers, and we are keeping our online registers, duplicating them also there. For example, in Estonia, we don't have land registry on the paper. It's only online. So now you know where we're keeping the copies. So which means that governments have to be innovative, and governments have to cooperate, again I'm saying the same thing, with multi-stakeholders, with public sector, with industry. And the industry is the one, come on, you have money. You're the best lobbyists in the world. You have to dictate the government. You have to push the government, and you have to educate consumers. Because in the end, consumers of your products are voters. If they want online voting, if they want government to pay attention to cybersecurity, trust me, government will do it.
I agree completely that they should be caring about regulation and where their industries are going and being a bit more proactive. I definitely agree with you. I think the thing is that folks in Washington D.C., a lot of them are in the Isaiah Berlin classification of the hedgehog or the fox, where the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. This is these are all hedgehogs. They know how to make their geeky thing, and they are pointed at that, and they don't really think about the rest of it. But they should, I agree. To the question of when to regulate, I think it's really a matter of when there's a market failure, for sure, or when a first principle is being violated. I think at the national level, regulations come from values, and what's going to work in India is going to be different from what works or is preferable to Americans. I remember, watching the Edward Snowden issue play out around the world. There were some countries that were absolutely incensed, many of which were in Europe. And then there were others where it didn't really register quite so much. And I remember being in India when that was currently, major headline news, and I was meeting with, many of you probably know Santosh Desai, and I asked him, I said, he's a major ad man, he writes a lot in the papers here, really interesting guy. I said, why is it that this is not a bigger issue in India? He said, Julian, I don't know if you've ever been in an Indian household. We have no privacy. There's always someone looking over your shoulder. No, everybody knows what everybody else is doing. There's no wonder that it's not a bigger issue here. It's because this idea of privacy is almost a Western invention. We just don't have that. Same thing in China. You go to the doctor's office, there's like dozens of people watching and taking notes and things like that you don't know if they're even doctors themselves. So anyway, I mean, a lot of this stuff comes from culture, and it's up to countries themselves to decide. India, for instance, cryptocurrencies are having a tough time here. And why is that? Because capital controls for one, but also strong feelings about black money and not wanting folks moving money around and hiding it the way that you can with cryptocurrencies. China, same story. They don't want capital flight. And it was lasting for a little while in China that wealthy families under Xi Jinping's anti-corruption drive were moving a lot of their money overseas, and they were trying to use Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to do it. So so anyway, I mean, I think it really just comes down to that. That's what I see in the world, and I think that that's probably the way it still should be. Because if you've got government getting way out in front of industry on these things, what are they gonna write? I don't think that even government wants to start thinking ahead like that, right? Or maybe they do. I don't know.
So I have permission to jump in. So I want to jump in and say what we're not hearing and what we're not discussing is, and I'm including myself in this, is we're not discussing what we mean by regulation. And here I think we need to be very, very disruptive, both those of us on the panel here and others who are thinking about this. Regulation is clearly not only top-down laws. I've said this is the third time I'm saying this. And this is perhaps a more boring piece than some of the things that we've discussed. But we had a conference a few years ago at the University of Haifa called the Algorithmic State, which really pushed a lot of us to get into that dark, spiderwebby cave of standardization. And for example, for 20 years ahead of the rollout of 5G, engineers at the ITU and in other places were working hard on developing this kind of this standard, without perhaps thinking in their minds that what they're doing is really regulating into the future. It's a sort of a plea, I think, for us to think a lot more broadly about how government information that's released into the marketplace and decisions on what kind of numbers are shared and what kind of numbers are not shared. Public access to government data on how markets are shaped. And yes, standardization, public adaptability of technological innovations, how all of this plays a part on how we think about regulation in a broader sense.
I want
One
to just
more
make
comment before questions. Go ahead.
I want to make a small point. Regulation is not control. We don't want a controller from the government tell you what to do. Exactly. Regulation is intercede the rights of the consumer and the innovator. How do you protect a person who's a user of technology, not a creator or an innovator, from the abuse of the technology by somebody who gets everything about you? Now, we have to redo the way we regulate. It doesn't mean you have a competition commission, which is maybe required, or somebody else who's going to control and put it down. But from bottoms up, people are not going to self-regulate because it's not in the interest to self-regulate. Let me give an algorithm. There are millions of innovators, easy to innovate, unbelievably fast to spread because of the web. You can spread it around the world through apps, and people can download and start using before you know what is happening. And then there are major corporations who have got quasi-monopolies, who capture the regulators, who go to Congress or wherever you go, pay the lobbyists and get everything done and write all the rules to protect themselves. And bottom layer is there. And then the poor consumers who are 2 generations behind as users of technology. We can't keep up with technology. We can't keep up. We're all lost. The great majority of humans are lost. Now, what do you do in this circumstance is what we got to think. And that's why it's very important that we have people who are current, to understand, who are looking in the future, start educating the public, like she said. I mean, in Estonia is 1.3 million people. It's a very small country, easy to regulate, to teach children and change human behavior. In a country like India with 1.3 billion people, by the time you do all this is 40 years. And something else has happened, you're obsolete. The moment you start and roll out, you're obsolete. In the United States, 315 million people. It's very difficult. So we have to think of new ways, but the only way I would think is we need much more of proactiveness from the form of who rules the world today, people like you who write regulations, who sit in government bodies, to think about the future and just share ideas so that people understand. When Microsoft went under the trust laws, they changed the behavior, and that's why Google came up. If you read that article, which I think Washington Post wrote, they write very clearly, because Microsoft's behavior about the internet and using, the ways to get into the internet changed because they started thinking, if I do this, how will somebody react? Because they're going after me. And Google came by, and in the lacuna, now Google has gone up. Now, this is what should be done, so people start thinking, like she said, that, how do we make sure that we are fair?
Okay, so with that, questions from the floor.
Yeah. Given the few questions we've received, I think the audience is yet to come out of the shock of the discussion. So So I have a few questions from the floor which are kind of along the same line, so I'm just going to club them. So from Amazon using drones for delivery to darknet, dark web, where arms sales are happening, illegal arms sales, and from Silicon Valley where the development is happening, to Timbuktu and Papua where people are not even aware. How do you kind of bring this together and regulate these problems?
Okay, so who would like to take that?
Mohan?
Okay.
We let people live in blissful ignorance and have an happy experience, because you can't do it.
What I'd like to say is that I said it with international law, but the same, I think it's time to de-cyber everything. We think that cyber is something very sophisticated, cyber is something very special. Yes, it's special, but it's just means of doing something. We all have laws and regulations nationally, and those laws and regulations apply. And no difference whether you commit a crime online or you commit a crime offline, whether you rob somebody offline or you go and buy something from the darknet, dark web. So I would say that we have the laws and regulations in place, and we have to fulfill the laws and regulations. And let's de-cyber. Cyber came to stay. Cyber is not something out there. It's part of our life, but it's just means of doing that way something. And may I say, small. Don't think that 1.3 million is easy to get into one room. Our startups, our people. So with 1.3 million, it might be as difficult as with 1.3 billion. But what I think our people have understood, that through cyber and ICTs, small can be much bigger. Without cyber, we wouldn't be on the same stage. I would be, I don't know where, in the woods. But thanks to cyber, I would say, my country is, if not 1.3 billion, then at least 4 million.
Challenges that you face.
Julian, did you want to?
Yeah, you know, I think it's probably pretty obvious that it's just going to be on a country-by-country basis which countries get drone-delivered Amazon goods, right? And it's because every country has different feelings about its airspace. They have different laws on the books, different assets to protect. India is very sensitive about its airspace. They don't like satellite phones. You know, I mean that's a different category, but they don't like orthographic photography particularly. So any place where you have that, I have to believe that Amazon is incorporating that into their strategic planning and their market selection process. And then it's up to, you know, voters to press, you know, their politicians to either relax those or come up with a specific set for those, or for those regulators in those countries to go and make a trip to Seattle and say, hey, how can we work this out?
So there's a follow-up question to that discussion. What about the liabilities arising out of the actions of artificial intelligence? Who will be responsible if AI incorrectly identifies potential criminals?
Yeah, so the question is regarding liabilities for AI, who will be responsible? So, international lawyer, over to you.
Liabilities for AI. Wow, how many hours do we have? So, yeah, there's no way around this. There is no answer. An easy way out might be to say where we are now. The lex lata, the existing law, is that on a national basis, the basis of national legislation, similar to what you've said about drones, national legislation, whatever the laws are on the books, and this is top-down legislation in its classic sense, that's what will determine liability. Clearly, that's not a full answer. And the easy way to get out of this one is to say that we're really far away from understanding what the line is between the liability issues of the human and or computers who've programmed the AI, and at what point the AI takes over as an autonomous being or autonomous set of algorithmic decisions. I don't think anybody can pretend to have a good answer to the situation right now. Where it is playing out, and this is public knowledge, it's not a secret, where this is playing out, I think, most acutely right now is in military hostility contexts, where these are life and death situations, and the liability is not monetary, but is really liability for taking the life of another human. And I'll stop there and simply say this is one of those questions that we are really beginning to wrestle with and don't quite have answers for yet.
Just very briefly, because
Sure.
I mentioned the law being drafted back in Estonia. It's in the process of drafting. At the moment, they're, for example, looking into the same insurances like we have with cars. That's one of the options. But please Google artificial intelligence Estonia draft law, and you will find information about that. But they do not have final position yet.
Yeah, and on AI, I just want to add that some non-governmental organizations are looking at AI, building research into what could be the problems, what should be addressed. OECD has taken on this work, and they are mapping out what research needs to be done now, and ultimately it will lead to high-level principles. And as we've seen with other OECD work, that the high-level principles often travel, you know, as the privacy principles traveled and became the CBPRs ultimately in APEC, that we would expect the same thing to be happening with the OECD AI principles. And there's more organizations than just OECD looking at this issue.
Yeah, that's prompted me, if I could just throw this in, because I think this is, I wouldn't have remembered this if you hadn't said this, but I think out of the Berkman Institute at Harvard or MIT or a joint project, we have one of these organizations, which are actually the AI programmers, the techies, the ones with the ponytails that you referred to, have come out with an ethics document on how to start looking at liability issues. So I think that's, again, it goes to the multi-stakeholder piece as well.
You see, we are far away from AI thinking like human beings and acting like human beings, still far away, still a machine. It can't think for itself laterally like a human brain. So let's be clear about that, because the total quantum of experiences is just not there. It's very nascent. But what we can do is deconstruct the AI problem into use of AI, into malignant AI, or various categories, and then fix the liability based upon use, based upon impact, based upon who gets hurt, etc.
So with that, let me thank our panelists, and again, thanks very much to Gateway.